C.S. Lewis once penned some thoughts on worship. He was writing in the face of liturgical innovators in England who seemed to think that every worship service needed to be a kind of a variety show, with each week being different from the week prior. Lewis had no truck with this kind of thinking. Worship, Lewis wrote, should be a bit like dancing. Once you've learned how to dance and have become good at it, you are able to immerse yourself in the dance and just do it almost without thinking about it. But if you must constantly look down at your feet, if you have to think about each movement before you actually make it, then you can't dance, but are just learning how to dance. Worship is like that, Lewis thought. A believer should be able to move through the liturgy without having to check his every movement first. An ideal service would be one you hardly notice, in the sense of you simply being immersed and caught up in a set of actions and a series of thoughts that are fully part of you already. Overall, I think Lewis makes a good point. But still, I would throw in a cautionary note to his analogy. Worship may be like dance that you are so good at that you can just do it freely and flowingly. But we dare not forget who our dance partner is. This morning's scripture is part of a chapter that paints a story that turns from grief and anger to one of uncontrolled joy, and then to one maybe back to anger. See, David wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, but his first attempt failed. It failed because he put the Ark on a cart drawn by oxen, and as they were traveling in, the cart stumbled, and a friend of David's, a lieutenant named Uzzah, made an attempt to sturdy the ark to keep it from falling. So he reached out and touched the ark, and God struck him dead, because you couldn't touch the ark where God was at. So Uzzah dies in what seems like a cruel judgment for only trying to offer support to the ark and to keep it from falling. And David is in despair. He's angry at God for this, what seems to be unjust, until he finds out that he wasn't following the rules for the ark. That the ark is not to be placed on a cart and drawn by oxen, but is to be carried by priests. It's to be treated as something special. So later, David returns to the place where he left the ark, and this time he follows the rules for carrying the ark, and he leads a procession with the ark into the city. It was an important moment in the history of Israel. The ark symbolized God's presence, and by bringing it into Israel's capital city, the people were effectively saying that their lives would center around God. David was really getting into the spirit of the events, dancing without restraint as an act of praise to God. The text makes the point to tell us that David wore only a linen ephod, which is essentially a loincloth. That does not mean that the king was in his underwear, but rather that he understood the religious significance of the day, for the ephod was a ceremonial garment usually worn by the priests. What is a little odd, however, is that the priests normally wore their ephods over other garments, whereas David wore only the ephod. Perhaps he was just trying to stay cool in the heat of the day while doing all that vigorous dancing. For whatever the reason, the ephod would not have covered him very well, especially with all the dancing around. And as David led the procession into the city, his wife, Michal, viewed this pageantry from her window. And by this point, David had several wives, but Michal, who was the daughter of the previous King Saul, was his first wife. And she had come into the relationship loving David. But a lot of water had since gone under the bridge, and their relationship had soured. In any case, as Michal now looked out the window and saw her husband leaping around, scantily clad, she was suddenly filled with loathing for him. And the text words it this way: she despised him in her heart. Does that ever happen to you? Have you ever had a sudden overwhelming feeling of displeasure or even disgust because of some behavior by someone you rely on or love? Or have you ever received such a scorn where someone you've counted as a friend or coworker or perhaps even your spouse all at once erupted with caustic criticism and scorn for something that you were doing and enjoying? How do you think it would make you feel? Probably not very good. In the case of David and Michal, it was the final breakdown of their already shaky relationship. They didn't actually divorce, but Michal was likely exiled from David's presence thereafter. He had other wives and probably didn't miss her that much. And the biblical author sums it up by saying that Michal had no child to the day of her death, probably meaning that David never again took her to his bed. In all likelihood, most of us have had incidents in our relationships like that where someone else has not lived up to our expectations of them or where we have not lived up to theirs. But that raises a question about whether we are right in judging others by our expectations of them. Are we right to measure others by who we are? Can we imagine the object of our scolding saying, "Who died and made you boss?" There's something to be said in favor of being able to live without trying to conform to anybody else's expectations of us. In fact, that very idea was a big part of pop philosophy that took hold back in the 1960s, a school of thought that focused on individualism. Its main idea is probably best summed up by a few lines written by Friedrich Perls, a psychologist and developer of a branch of psychology called Gestalt. Those lines, sometimes called the Gestalt prayer, go like this: I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I, and if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. That philosophy was a useful corrective to the notion in some relationships that the other person is there to fulfill all of our so-called needs, and even in some demanding relationships where we're to fulfill all of our whims. But Pearl's lines also go too far in the direction of I have no responsibility for how my friend, partner, coworker, spouse, relative, or anybody else is touched by what I do. Would you really want to live in relationships where the only place you intersect with others is when your individual interests happen to coincide? That does seem to be what the individualism movement advocated. To again quote Pearls, whom this moment considered a kind of poet laureate, quote, I hope to make you understand how much you gain by taking responsibility for every emotion you feel, for every movement you make, for every thought you have, and shed responsibility for anyone else. We touch each other by honestly being what we are, not by intentionally making contact. Wow. As I said, I think that may be a corrective to the other extreme, but it's also a pretty lonely way to live. In the scripture before us, it's pretty hard to fault David in this particular case, as God himself did not reject David's celebratory actions. But we may also sympathize with Michal's plight too, if not with the way that she chose to handle it. Fairly early in her marriage, when her father Saul was still on the throne, David had to flee for his life when Saul tried to kill him. In fact, Michal helped her husband escape, knowing that he would have to leave her behind. And once David was out of reach, Saul took Michal and, giving her no choice, presented her in marriage to another man. In the meantime, David acquired a couple more wives, and as far as we know, made no attempt to ever communicate with Michal. Years later, when he finally got the throne for himself, he ordered that Michal be restored to him. Some biblical scholars think that David did not do this because he missed her after all those years, but did it to secure his rule over what had been her father's realm. And once again, nobody considers Michal's wishes. She was taken from her second marriage and brought to David's palace. And even after all of that, however, it doesn't appear that she began to despise David until this day when he failed to live up to her idea of how a king should behave. But once that happened, she made no bones about telling him how she felt. This story reminds us that there are some questions that we ought to ask ourselves when we are inclined to scold someone for actions that don't measure up to our expectations. And the first is this: what will a diatribe accomplish? Well, the answer I think we probably can guess. Not much that's helpful. Criticism seldom brings desired results. The old saying about catching more flies with honey than with vinegar applies here, but I'm more moved by the biblical principle of loving thy neighbor. That often means trying to see things from the other person's point of view, to see things from their window, as it were. And that's not necessarily agreeing, but it is trying to understand what a position or action means to the other person. And when we do that, it may leave us still needing to confront the other person, but now with something other than a tirade. When we take time to look from their window, we are more likely to attack the issue than the person. Another question that we should ask is, what drummer is the other person dancing to? Now, either Michal didn't understand or she didn't care that David was dancing to God's tune. But David was dancing to God's tune. And just because we wouldn't act as another person acts doesn't make their actions wrong by definition. And it is always possible that the other person is listening to God better than we are, or that what God is asking of that person, whoever that may be, is different from what God is asking of us. And there's one more question. What is our sense of relationship? In the case of Michal and David, there wasn't much relationship left. But is that where we want to be? Whether our connection is with the other person as a friend to friend, a partner to partner, colleague to colleague, coworker to coworker, parent to child, spouse to spouse, church to church, denomination to denomination. We should be working in terms of relationship. Is battering the other person verbally or storming on their parade a way of enhancing our connection to that person and theirs to us? Relationship usually implies some level of caring. But how caring can we be when we are blasting another because they don't measure up to the yardstick of how we would have them behave? See, relationship doesn't mean agreeing with or overlooking troublesome behaviors, but it does mean trying to understand each other's expectations. It means that where we feel these expectations are unreasonable, we talk about them and we explain our feelings. And where we cannot agree, often we can live within our differences. To some degree, all of this should be common sense. But when we're talking about human relationships, listen, church. When we're talking about human relationships, we are also talking about an arena in which our Christianity gets lived out. It's fine to talk about Christian love, but human relationships are the major places where that love gets applied or fails to be applied. So if we're going to use the word Christian about ourselves, we need to look for a window on our relationships that is large enough that we see more than Michal's limited and self-centered view. Now, it's true we can't expect to see things as God does, for His window is bigger than any we will ever have. But we can do better than just measure everybody else's by our tastes and our expectations. What we need to do is we need to pray for bigger windows. And I believe that that is a prayer that God will honor. But we have to be willing to ask. And God will honor it, and we are able to do it because we, as Christians, have Christ living in us, and Christ lives in us because Christ lives. Amen.